There are cases that look simple on paper, clean, predictable, the kind where decisions are made quickly because everything appears to line up. Documents filed, claims stated, ownership transferred. But every now and then, something small, something almost invisible, gets overlooked. And that one missing detail doesn't just change the outcome. It exposes everything that went wrong along the way. I've followed enough of these cases to recognize the pattern. It usually starts with confidence. One side certain they're right. The other side too quiet, too overlooked, or too tired to fight back properly. And by the time the truth surfaces, it doesn't just correct a mistake. It reveals a system that almost allowed injustice to become permanent. This is one of those stories. It begins on land that had been worked longer than most people in that county could remember. Acres of soil that weren't just owned, they were lived in. Every fence post, every row of crops, every uneven patch of ground carried history. The farmer who stood on that land now was named Thomas Hale. He wasn't a man who spoke much, not because he couldn't, but because he had spent most of his life working in silence. Farming has a way of shaping people like that. It teaches patience, repetition, and a kind of resilience that doesn't need to announce itself. For years, Thomas had worked that land alongside his wife, Margaret. They had built something steady, not flashy, not wealthy, but stable. The kind of life where every improvement came slowly, honestly. A repaired barn, a better irrigation line, a new section of fencing after months of saving. Margaret handled the paperwork, the finances, the details Thomas never cared much for. Not because he ignored them, but because he trusted her completely. And for decades, that trust was never misplaced. Until the day she was gone. Margaret's death didn't come with warning. It left Thomas in a house that suddenly felt too large, too quiet. The routines they had built together didn't disappear, but they changed. Meals became simpler, evenings longer, work heavier in a way that had nothing to do with the physical effort. But Thomas kept going, because the land didn't stop. Crops still needed tending, seasons still moved forward, and for a while, it seemed like life, in its quiet way, would continue. Until the letter arrived. It wasn't dramatic, just an official envelope, clean, formal, impersonal. Inside was a notice that didn't make sense. It stated that the land Thomas lived on, the land he had worked for decades, was no longer legally his. According to the document, ownership had been transferred due to an outstanding debt tied to the property. A debt that had supposedly gone unpaid long enough to trigger repossession proceedings. Thomas read it once, then again. The words didn't change. At first, he assumed it was a mistake, a clerical error, something that could be resolved with a phone call, a visit, a simple explanation. So he went into town. The office he entered wasn't unfamiliar. He had been there before, years ago, always alongside Margaret. But this time, he stood alone. And the conversation didn't go the way he expected. The clerk behind the desk spoke politely, calmly, but with a kind of distance that comes from dealing with paperwork, not people. According to their records, there had been a loan taken against the property, not recently, years ago. The payments had been irregular, then they had stopped, not recently, years ago. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, not panic, not yet, just confusion, because he had never stopped working that land. He had never received any notice. No warnings, no final demand, nothing that suggested the property was in danger. But the records were clear, or at least they appeared to be. When Thomas asked for details, the clerk printed out a series of documents, dates, signatures, payment histories, and there it was, Margaret's name. His first instinct wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Margaret handled everything. If there had been a loan, she would have managed it, paid it, explained it, unless something had gone wrong that he never knew about. The thought sat heavy, but the system didn't pause for uncertainty. Within weeks, the situation escalated. A company, one that specialized in acquiring distressed properties, stepped in to enforce the claim. Their representatives arrived with efficiency, measured, professional, unemotional. They walked the land like it already belonged to them. Thomas tried to explain. He told them there had to be a mistake, that he had lived there his entire life, that his wife had handled the finances, and he needed time to understand what had happened. But they weren't there to listen. They were there to execute. And slowly, something else began to reveal itself. Their confidence wasn't just based on paperwork. It was based on certainty that Thomas wouldn't fight back. He was older, alone, unfamiliar with legal systems, the kind of person who, statistically, accepts outcomes rather than challenges them. And at first, it seemed like they were right, because Thomas didn't hire a lawyer immediately. He didn't file motions or counterclaims. He went home, and he sat at the kitchen table where Margaret used to organize everything. Drawers filled with papers, old envelopes, receipts, notes written in her careful handwriting. For days, he went through them, slowly, methodically, not because he knew what he was looking for, but because he refused to believe that everything they had built could disappear without reason. Meanwhile, the company continued moving forward. They filed formal eviction proceedings. They scheduled assessments. They treated the outcome as inevitable, and the language they used began to shift. Where there had once been Mr. Hale, there was now the occupant. Where there had been conversation, there was now instruction. The assumption was clear. This was already over. When the court date was set, Thomas almost didn't go. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't believe it would matter. That's what happens when systems move faster than understanding. People start to feel like participants in something already decided. But someone changed that. A neighbor. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She had lived nearby for years, close enough to see the farm, to notice the routines, to understand what that land meant to Thomas. When she heard what was happening, she didn't accept it quietly. She drove over, sat with him, listened, and when she realized he was preparing to let it go, she pushed back, not aggressively, not forcefully, but firmly. She told him something simple. If there's even a chance something isn't right, you don't walk away. That was enough. Thomas went to court. The room wasn't large, not dramatic, just functional, the kind of place where decisions are made without spectacle. On one side sat the representatives of the company, clean suits, organized files, quiet confidence. On the other side sat Thomas, alone, a folder of documents in front of him, many of which he didn't fully understand. And at the front, the judge, a man named Richard Lawson. He had seen cases like this before, property disputes, debt enforcement, situations where the outcome, more often than not, followed the documentation. But he also had something else: patience. The proceedings began as expected. The company's legal team presented their case clearly: the loan, the missed payments, the legal right to repossess, everything aligned, on paper. When it was Thomas's turn, he didn't argue in legal terms. He didn't challenge statutes or procedures. He told his story, about the land, about Margaret, about the life they had built, about the fact that he had never been notified, never warned, never given a chance to correct anything. It wasn't polished, but it was real. And for a moment, the room shifted, not enough to change the outcome, but enough to introduce doubt. Judge Lawson listened carefully. Then he asked a question that seemed small. "Do you have any records of payments made?" Thomas hesitated, because the official records said no. But then he remembered something, not a document in the folder he brought, something he had seen at the house. He asked for time. The company's legal team objected, politely but firmly. They argued that the evidence had already been presented, that delays were unnecessary. But Judge Lawson didn't rush. He granted the request. Thomas returned home, and this time he searched differently. Not broadly, not blindly. He focused. Old boxes, drawers he had already gone through, places where Margaret might have kept something separate, something important. Hours passed, then more, and just when it began to feel like there was nothing left to find, he saw it, tucked inside an envelope that had been folded into the back of a ledger. A receipt. Old, slightly worn, but clear. It showed a payment, a significant one, made toward the very loan the company claimed had gone unpaid. The date mattered, because it fell within the period where the records showed nothing. And suddenly, the story wasn't as clean as it had seemed. Thomas returned to court. This time, when he placed the receipt on the table, something changed. The company's legal team didn't dismiss it immediately, because they couldn't. It was real. Judge Lawson examined it closely, the details, the signature, the account reference. Then he asked for verification. What followed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was decisive. The payment existed. It had been made. And more importantly, it had not been properly recorded. That one error didn't just affect a balance. It affected the entire timeline of the loan, which meant the claim of default wasn't accurate. The foundation of the repossession began to crack. The company's confidence shifted, subtly at first, then more visibly, because what had been presented as a straightforward case was now something else entirely. Incomplete. Judge Lawson didn't rush his decision. He reviewed everything again, carefully, thoroughly, because now it wasn't just about a missed entry. It was about what that entry represented. A failure in the system, a moment where someone had done the right thing, and the system hadn't recognized it. When the decision came, it was clear. The repossession was invalid. The claim against the property was overturned. Thomas Hale would not lose his land. The room was quiet, but the weight of that moment was undeniable, because this wasn't just a legal correction. It was the restoration of something that should never have been taken. The company didn't argue further. They couldn't, because the truth had been established, and it had come from something so small. It was almost missed. A single receipt. After the case, Thomas returned home. The land was still there. The same fields, the same fences, the same quiet stretches of earth that had carried his life. But something had changed. Not in the land, in him. Because he had come close to losing everything, not because he failed, but because something went unnoticed. And that realization stays with a person. Judge Lawson, in his final remarks, said something that didn't make headlines, but mattered more than most people realized. Accuracy is not a technicality. It is the foundation of justice. Because without it, decisions don't just become flawed. They become harmful, and in this case, harm had almost been made permanent. What this story reveals isn't just the importance of one document, it's the danger of assumption, the risk of moving forward based on incomplete understanding. The quiet way systems can fail people, not through malice, but through oversight, and how easily those failures can become final if no one stops to question them. Thomas didn't win because he was powerful. He didn't win because he had influence. He won because the truth existed, and someone took the time to look for it. And sometimes, that's all justice needs. Not noise, not force, just the willingness to keep looking until what's real finally comes into view.